The night the blizzard nearly buried the small mountain town of Creston, Colorado, Caleb Whitmore was doing what he always did when the bills were stacking up. He was working. His beat-up pickup truck crawled down the last stretch of highway after his final delivery run, wipers slapping furiously at the snow. His old German shepherd, Rusty, pressed against the passenger window and growling low at the dark tree line. Caleb thought nothing of it at first. Rusty was always chasing shadows, always pretending to be younger than he was. But then the dog threw himself against the door with a force that made the whole truck shudder, and Caleb had no choice but to stop. He climbed out into the bitter cold, flashlight cutting a pale beam through the white curtain of falling snow, and followed the dog into the woods. He found drag marks first, then blood, then a woman lying face down and motionless in the snow, her expensive cashmere coat soaked dark red at the shoulder. No phone, no wallet, no ID of any kind. And by the next morning, when the television on his kitchen counter flickered to life and the news anchor said the words "Missing CEO, Madison Hale, 72 hours unaccounted for," Caleb Whitmore realized the unconscious woman he had carried back to his worn-out sofa was the most searched person in America. Whether he had just saved her life or pulled his daughter and himself into something they could never walk away from, he was about to find out. Creston sat at 7,000 feet above sea level and functioned, in most practical ways, as though the rest of the country had agreed to forget about it. The population barely cracked 2,000 in summer, and by January the number was closer to 1,200 stubborn souls who either loved the silence or simply had nowhere else to go. Caleb Whitmore belonged to the second category, though he would never have said so out loud. He had grown up just over the ridge in a smaller town that no longer existed on any map, and he had settled in Creston after the accident because Creston was where the hospital was, and then the hospital was where the funeral had been, and somehow he had never quite managed to leave after that. His wife, Dana, had been killed 5 years earlier when a logging truck lost its brakes on the descent into town and struck her car on a blind curve. She died before the paramedics arrived. Caleb had been on a mountain rescue call 20 miles away, unreachable by radio, and by the time he got back, Bonnie was sitting in the hospital waiting room with a social worker neither of them knew, wearing Dana's coat over her small shoulders, because no one had thought to bring a jacket for a 7-year-old who had just lost her mother. He had been a search and rescue specialist with the county mountain team for almost 8 years before the accident. He was good at it, better than good, and the work had given him a sense of purpose that little else could match. But a torn ACL and 2 shattered menisci from a bad fall the following winter had ended that career faster than any paperwork could explain. The surgeries were expensive, the recovery was long, and when it was over he could still walk and still work. But the uneven mountain terrain that rescue operations demanded was no longer something his knee would tolerate for more than a few hours at a time. So he pieced together a living the best he could. He drove overnight delivery routes for an online pharmacy contractor. He repaired generators and small engines out of his detached garage. In winter, he cleared driveways and parking lots for a flat rate that was always slightly too low because he kept forgetting to raise it. The total, in a decent month, came to somewhere around $2,300 after fuel. The rent on their small rented house was $850. After utilities, groceries, and Rusty's arthritis medication, the math never quite worked out, and Caleb went to sleep most nights, staring at the water stain on the ceiling and running numbers that refused to add up. Bonnie was 7 years old and already possessed the quiet, observational quality of a child who had learned early that the adults around her were carrying more than they could easily set down. She asked for very little. When her sneakers wore through at the toe that October, she found a roll of silver duct tape in the garage and fixed them herself, tucking the tape under the inner sole so Caleb wouldn't see it and feel bad. She helped with dishes without being asked, learned to start the pellet stove on her own, and fed Rusty every morning with the kind of cheerful routine that made the dog's entire back half wag. She talked about her mother sometimes, matter-of-factly, the way children do when grief has simply become part of the furniture of their lives. She said things like, "Mama would have liked this soup," or "Mama always did that thing with her hands when she was thinking too." And Caleb would nod and say, "She would have." She did, and then they would both go on eating. Rusty was 11 years old, which for a German Shepherd placed him firmly in the category of elderly, though he maintained a professional dignity about the whole thing that Caleb respected deeply. He had been Caleb's working partner during the rescue years, trained to locate human scent beneath snow and through dense forest. Most of that sharpness remained. His hips ached on cold mornings, and he slept more than he used to, but his nose still worked with a precision that no instrument Caleb had ever carried in the field could match. On the night of the storm, Rusty's nose was the only reason any of them were still alive by the following week. That Tuesday was the worst weather system to hit the Colorado high country in 11 years. The temperature dropped to -14 by 9 in the evening, and the wind off the peaks was gusting to nearly 50 miles per hour, driving the snow horizontal in long white sheets that swallowed headlights and blotted out lane markings, and made every drive feel like navigation through a static screen. Caleb's last delivery was to an elderly man on the far edge of the valley who needed his prescription and would not last the night without it. The contractor paid $40 extra for storm night runs. Caleb always took them. The drive back was the kind that tests whether a person is genuinely calm under pressure or simply running too tired to be afraid. The highway between Ridgecrest Road and the turnoff toward Creston wound through approximately 4 miles of unplowed mountain pass, flanked on one side by a sheer granite face, and on the other by a drop into a creek bed that, in winter, was nothing but a sound of rushing water somewhere far below the snowpack. Caleb knew the road in the way you only know a thing after 10 years of driving it in conditions that should have sent you somewhere else. He kept the truck in second gear, hands loose on the wheel, letting the chains do their work. Rusty was sitting upright in the passenger seat, which was unusual. The dog normally slept on drives, his chin resting on the door handle, his gray muzzle soft and slack. But tonight he was alert, head erect, ears swiveled forward. He made a sound that was somewhere between a whine and a growl, not aggressive, but urgent, the way he used to sound when a buried person was close but not yet found. Caleb slowed the truck without quite deciding to. He said, "What is it, Russ?" And Rusty responded by pressing both front paws against the dashboard and barking once, sharply, in the direction of the tree line to the east. Caleb pulled off the road onto the compacted gravel of a forestry access turnout and cut the engine. The silence outside was the specific, insulated silence of a heavy snowfall sound, absorbed rather than absent, the world muffled down to a single low frequency that pressed against the ears. He clipped Rusty's lead, opened the door, and felt the cold hit his face like a thrown object. The dog pulled immediately and hard, dragging him off the turnout and into the deeper snow at the edge of the tree line, nosing under the lowest branches, and then plunging forward into the dark between the pines. The flashlight found the first sign within 30 feet, a furrow in the snow, shallow at first and then deep, the kind of mark left by someone dragging themselves rather than walking. Then, caught on the broken stub of a spruce branch at shoulder height, a woman's silk scarf in a dark color burgundy or navy. It was impossible to tell in the flashlight's cold beam. Rusty was already ahead, barking short and rhythmic in the pattern Caleb recognized from his rescue years as the alert for a located subject. He pushed through the snow at a half-run, following the sound, and came into a small clearing where the dog was standing over a figure curled in the snow against the base of a fallen tree. She was wearing a long wool coat that had likely cost more than Caleb's truck, and her dark hair was spread against the white-like ink on paper. Her hands, visible where the coat had ridden up, were deeply lacerated across the palms and fingers, the blood already gone nearly black in the cold. Her right ankle was turned at an angle that made his stomach drop. He knelt and pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Her pulse was there, thready and slow, but present. Her skin was the color of old wax. He had pulled people off mountainsides in worse condition and gotten them home breathing, but not many, and not in temperatures like this. He did a rapid assessment the way he had been trained. Airway clear, breathing shallow but regular, no obvious spinal injury that movement would worsen, core temperature severely compromised. There was no signal on his phone out here. The nearest emergency services were a 40-minute response time in good weather, and tonight the weather was catastrophic. He made the decision he had been trained never to make without backup, and immediately understood why the training never accounted for situations like this. He was going to move her. When he slid one arm under her shoulders and began to lift her, her hand shot out and seized his forearm with a grip that surprised him. Her fingers were wrapped around a small rectangular object, and even in the state she was in, she was holding it with the specific intentionality of someone who has decided that whatever she is holding matters more than her own survival. It was a USB drive, small and dark, smeared with dried blood along one edge. Her eyes did not open. Her grip did not loosen. Caleb wrapped her hand in his own, USB and all, and carried her to the truck. He had the heater running before they reached the highway. He did not look back at the road behind him until he was already a mile away, and when he did, he saw, for just a moment, a pair of headlights sitting motionless at the forestry turnout where he had parked. A large vehicle, dark-colored, running without its high beams on. Then the snow swallowed it, and it was gone. The house was warm by the standard of what Caleb's pellet stove could manage on a January night, which meant it was approximately 62 degrees in the main room and somewhat colder everywhere else. Bonnie woke up without being asked. She heard the truck and the unfamiliar weight of a second set of footsteps, and came out of her room in her pajamas, fully present in the particular way that sleepy children sometimes are in emergencies, operating on instinct rather than understanding. She helped Caleb ease the woman onto the sofa without question. She went to the bathroom and came back with the first aid kit, the clean washcloths, and the kettle already filled and set to boil. At some point, she retrieved her stuffed rabbit, a worn gray thing she had slept with since she was 3, and tucked it into the crook of the woman's arm. Without explanation, Caleb cleaned and bandaged the lacerations as well as he could with what he had. The ankle was likely fractured, he could not be sure without imaging, but the swelling and the angle of displacement suggested at minimum a severe sprain and possibly something worse. He wrapped it firmly, elevated it on the sofa's armrest, and covered the woman in every blanket in the house. Rusty settled himself on the floor in front of the sofa and stayed there, his chin on his paws, watching the woman's face with the patient attention of a dog who has decided he is responsible for something. She came back to consciousness in the early hours of the morning, all at once and then fighting. Her eyes flew open, and she sat up fast, reaching for something that was not there. Her breath going ragged, and her gaze cycling around the room with the rapid processing of someone who had been prepared, at any moment, to run. Caleb, who had not slept and was sitting in the armchair across the room, spoke quietly. He said his name. He said where they were. He said she was safe, and that no one had followed them, though he was not entirely certain of the second part. It took a full minute for the tension to drain from her shoulders, her eyes fixed on Bonnie, asleep now in the armchair by the stove, still fully dressed, and something in the woman's expression shifted from panic into something older and more complicated. Her name, she said eventually, was Madison. She said it the way someone says a name they have been using so long it has worn smooth, not as an introduction but as a confirmation. She did not offer a last name. She said she had been in a car, that there had been a curve, that she had not been driving, that something had happened to the car, and she had run because running had been the only option that made any sense in the moment. She said she did not want to call the police yet. She said this carefully, watching his face, and he understood that she expected the statement to produce suspicion or argument. He did not argue. He had carried enough people off enough mountains to know that the story always came later, and the most important thing in any given moment was to keep breathing. He made tea. He handed her a mug. She wrapped both bandaged hands around it and looked around the room the way a person looks at a place they have never expected to find themselves, taking in the stack of overdue utility notices on the counter, the hand-me-down curtains, the duct-taped soles of a small pair of sneakers by the door. She did not say anything for a long time. Then the television, which Caleb had left on low for the noise, switched to the 6 a.m. news cycle. The anchor's voice filled the room with practiced gravity. Authorities continue to search tonight for Madison Hale, chief executive of Hale Biotech, missing now for more than 72 hours. Under circumstances investigators have described as deeply suspicious. The company's stock has fallen nearly 19% since news of her disappearance became public, and sources inside the FBI confirmed that federal agents joined the search as of yesterday afternoon. The photograph on screen showed a woman in a sharp navy suit at a podium, dark-haired, composed, projecting the specific kind of authority that is calibrated to make rooms full of powerful people feel that someone is in charge. Caleb looked at the television. He looked at the woman on his sofa. She met his eyes without flinching, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The story that came out over the next several hours, in pieces and not always in order, was larger than anything Caleb had imagined. When he'd pulled a woman out of the snow and carried her 3/4 of a mile to his truck. Madison Hale was 38 years old and had run Hale Biotech for 5 years, a mid-sized pharmaceutical research corporation worth approximately $4.8 billion at last count. She had taken the company public 18 months ago, been briefly famous for it, and then returned to the functional invisibility of being powerful without being recognized. She drove herself to work. She had no security detail. She had thought, until recently, that she didn't need one. What had changed was a set of documents she had discovered in a routine data audit 3 weeks earlier. Buried inside a nested subfolder on the company's internal research server was a secondary dataset that had not been submitted to any regulatory body and was not connected to any approved trial protocol. It contained clinical results from drug trials conducted over 4 years, trials in which 117 subjects, recruited from underfunded rural clinics in 3 states, had experienced adverse events that had never been reported. 42 of those patients had died. The cause of death had been attributed, in each case, to pre-existing conditions. The actual cause was the compound being tested. That compound had been sold, under a licensing agreement that appeared in no public record, to a pharmaceutical conglomerate called Meridian Labs, in exchange for $63 million deposited into a shell account in the Cayman Islands. The account was accessible to exactly 2 people: her chief financial officer, Hunter Graves, and the company's general counsel, Eleanor Pierce. Madison had confronted neither of them directly. She had been careful. She had copied the relevant files onto a drive, the drive she had been holding when Caleb found her, and had been on her way to a meeting with a federal regulator she trusted personally when the car she was riding in had been run off the highway by a second vehicle. The driver had been a man she had never seen before, a contract hire made through a staffing agency 2 weeks earlier, and when the car had gone off the embankment and the airbag had deployed. She had understood, with a clarity she described as almost restful, exactly what was happening and exactly what she needed to do. She had taken the drive from her bag, checked that the driver was breathing, and run. The direction she ran happened to be uphill, into the tree line, into the storm. Caleb listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The SUV I saw on the road. It wasn't looking for your car. It was looking for you." He walked to the window and looked out. The storm had thinned slightly in the early morning hours, and through the pale gray light, he could see the road that ran past the bottom of his property. There was nothing on it, but absence, he knew from years of working in the mountains, did not mean safety. It only meant that whatever was out there hadn't shown itself yet. The change in the house was subtle at first. Rusty began alerting at the windows in the night, standing rigid and silent with his ears pinned forward. The lock on the truck's passenger door showed fresh scratches around the keyhole, not wear, but the concentrated marks of something worked into the mechanism from outside. A set of boot prints on the north side of the house led from the tree line to within 10 feet of the kitchen window and back. He did not mention any of it to Bonnie, but she mentioned things to him first. One evening she told him she had seen a flashlight moving through the trees across the road the night before. She said it calmly, the way she said everything, and he nodded and told her she had good eyes. And then he went to the window and stood there long after she had gone back to her book. Madison knew, without being told, that she needed to leave. Her leg was not cooperating with that plan. The ankle fracture confirmed now by a remote consultation with a physician. Caleb reached through the county's emergency telehealth line, describing the injury as belonging to a friend in a rural area during the storm, would require at minimum 3 more weeks before she could walk without significant risk of permanent damage. The roads in and out of the valley were still restricted after the storm. She was not going anywhere on her own. She sat in the armchair by the stove on the 3rd evening, her leg elevated and Rusty's warm flank pressed against her side, and told Caleb she was sorry for what she had brought into his home. He was at the kitchen table, reviewing the month's bills with the patient resignation of a man who had been reviewing the same bills for 5 years and had never once found a different answer. He looked up and said, "You didn't bring it." "I went into the woods." She opened her mouth and he said, "Nobody should be left out there alone. That's all." He said it flatly, not heroically, and went back to the papers in front of him. He did not tell her that the words had come from somewhere specific, from the anger he had carried for 5 years about a curve on a mountain road and a woman who had bled out waiting for help that had not come fast enough. He did not tell her that leaving someone in the cold was the one thing he was constitutionally incapable of doing again. He just said the words and meant them, and Madison heard something in his voice that she would think about for a long time afterward. On the night of the 4th day, the knock at the door came at 11:30. 2 men, both in dark clothing, both wearing what appeared, through the door's small window, to be law enforcement credentials. Caleb asked them to slide their IDs under the door, which they did not expect, and he used his phone's flashlight to study the laminated cards. The badge numbers were formatted correctly for the county sheriff's department. The background color of the ID was wrong by 1 shade deep navy, instead of the standard medium blue he had seen on every county credential in the valley for the past decade. The license plate on the SUV, parked on the road outside, began with the letter sequence used for county fleet vehicles, but the county had switched to a new sequence 18 months earlier. None of these things alone would have registered to most people. Caleb had spent 8 years working alongside every law enforcement and emergency services agency in 3 counties, and the discrepancy landed on him with the physical weight of a fact. He moved without hesitation. He went to Madison first and helped her to her feet, handed her the crutch he had built from a length of PVC and 2 foam wraps from his toolbox, and guided her to the hallway. Bonnie was already awake. She had a child's instinct for adult alarm, and she came out of her room in her winter coat, which she had been sleeping in since the 2nd night of the strangers, her backpack already on her shoulders. Caleb pointed to the basement door, which opened onto a crawl space that ran under the entire house and exited through a wooden hatch in the foundation on the east side. He had shown Bonnie the hatch 2 years earlier as part of a general conversation about house safety, the kind of conversation single parents have alone because there is no one else to have it with. Rusty handled the situation in his own way. When one of the men forced the front door at the lock, the dog was waiting in the entryway with a controlled aggression that neither man appeared to have anticipated. And the delay, 20 seconds, perhaps 30, was enough. Caleb had killed the main power from the basement panel before he followed Madison and Bonnie through the crawl space. And by the time the 2 men found a flashlight and worked through the house, there was no one in it, and the east hatch was already swinging shut in the dark behind 3 sets of retreating footprints and 1 set of paw prints, filling slowly with new snow. They drove for 40 minutes in a truck borrowed from the equipment shed of a property Caleb maintained. in exchange for reduced rent. A battered blue Chevy that no one would associate with him. He had retrieved Rusty from the east side of the property where the dog had doubled back after the confrontation, moving through the tree line with the quiet efficiency of 11 years of working experience. Madison was in the back seat, with her legs stretched across Bonnie's lap, and Bonnie had her hand resting on the dog's back. And the cab was warm with breath and engine heat, and the specific intimacy of people who have shared fear together and come out the other side moving. The cabin belonged to a friend of Caleb's named Stuart, who used it for deer season and otherwise left it unlocked by agreement. It had a wood stove, 2 oil lamps, 3 sleeping bags, and a shelf of canned goods that represented the kind of emergency preparedness that most people talked about and never actually implemented. Caleb got the stove going within 10 minutes of arrival. Madison sat at the table and watched him work. And then she watched Bonnie help him work. And then she watched Rusty settle in front of the first warmth like a very old man who has earned his fire. She talked more than she had expected to. She told him about the town she had grown up in, smaller than Creston, a strip of double-wide trailers along a county road in a part of West Virginia where the mining had dried up. Her parents had died within 8 months of each other when she was 14. She had aged out of state care and put herself through college on loans and night shifts at a packaging plant. She had arrived in the corporate world with the specific combination of competence and fury that, in women, frequently gets described as cold. She had been called cold so many times that she had eventually accepted it as a job requirement. It was efficient. It worked. It was not. She understood now, sitting in a collapsing mountain cabin, eating ramen noodles from a camp pot, the same thing as being a person. She told him about the workforce reductions she had authorized in her first years at Hale Biotech, 2,200 positions, executed without any serious consideration of the faces behind the numbers. "I never asked what happened to them afterward," she said. "I just signed the papers and moved to the next item." The sound of it in the quiet cabin was plainly a kind of relief. Caleb was quiet. He had his hands around a coffee mug and he was looking at the stove. He said, "People made decisions about my wife, too. About how fast the ambulance went. About the road crew, and who was on shift that night." He said it without accusation, just observation. I don't know if anybody thought about her face. Madison did not say anything. Outside, the wind had dropped. And the silence was the cleaner kind that comes after a storm has moved on. The USB drive sat on the table between them in the lamplight, still carrying its dried smear of her blood. And neither of them looked away from it. The attack on the cabin came before dawn, and it was more organized than the attempt at the house. There were 4 of them, approaching from the tree line on the north and west sides in a pincer formation that Caleb identified from the sound of boot compression in crusted snow. A sound he knew precisely, having spent years listening for survivors and rescuers, both through exactly this kind of frozen terrain. He woke Madison and Bonnie in the dark, and directed them out the south window and down the embankment to the tree line with 3 minutes to spare. Then he stayed. He was not a soldier. He had no weapon beyond a folding knife and the contents of Stewart's equipment locker, which included 2 road flares, a length of aircraft cable used for towing, a battery-powered emergency strobe, and a detailed knowledge of the terrain. The aircraft cable, stretched ankle height between 2 pines in the approach corridor, took down the first man and created enough noise to alert the others to his position, which was the point. The emergency strobe triggered from 40 yards back and left running in a pine's low branches, provided a false focal point for the second and third men, who approached it cautiously and found nothing. Caleb moved in a wide arc through the trees, the way he had learned to move on night rescues, slowly, with absolute attention to footfall, pausing every 4th step to listen. He was not trying to fight them. He was trying to be somewhere they weren't looking until Bonnie and Madison were far enough away to matter. Hunter Graves found him anyway. He was younger than Caleb had imagined, late 40s, fit, wearing clothing that was expensive, even for a man standing in a forest at 4 a.m. One of his men had Caleb pinned by both arms before he had processed the sound behind him. Hunter stood in the tactical flashlight's beam and told him, with practiced precision, that Madison Hale was a woman in the early stages of a psychiatric breakdown who had stolen proprietary data and that Caleb had, perhaps unwittingly, aided her flight. He said there were ways this could go. He said Bonnie was a lovely name, that 7 was a vulnerable age, and that single parenthood was a difficult thing to manage under ordinary circumstances. Caleb looked at him and said nothing. He listened, which was what he had been trained to do when the person talking was telling you more than they intended to tell you. Madison had not run. This surprised her, because she had spent most of her adult life running away from poverty, away from vulnerability, away from any situation where she was not the most prepared person in the room. She had been running so efficiently and for so long that she had come to think of it as strategy rather than fear. But Caleb Whitmore was being held in a forest at 4 in the morning because he had carried her out of a snowstorm and given her a bowl of ramen noodles, and continuing to run was suddenly something she was unable to do. She had a number in her phone she had been carrying for 11 months without using it. It belonged to a journalist named Patricia Dunn, who had published 3 investigative pieces on pharmaceutical industry regulatory failures and been politely declined twice for comment. The second number was for a federal agent named Samuel Rice, who had sent a letter 14 months ago to Hale Biotech's legal department, requesting a voluntary compliance meeting, a meeting Eleanor Pierce had buried. Madison made both calls from a gas station pay phone on the county road 2 miles from the cabin, standing in the snow with Bonnie beside her, and Rusty pressed against her right leg, and she was clear about what she was offering and what she needed in return. Back at the cabin, Bonnie sat beside the wounded dog Rusty had taken a kick to the ribs during the initial confrontation, nothing broken but enough to make him move carefully, and cleaned the small gash on his flank with the first aid supplies from Madison's bag. She was 8 inches long and weighed 51 pounds, and she handled the task with a competence that made Rusty sit perfectly still and allow it. Madison watched the girl work and said, "Do you think your dad is okay?" Bonnie looked up. She considered the question with genuine seriousness, the way she considered most things. Then she said, "He always comes back." She did not say it to reassure Madison. She said it the way you say a thing that is simply true, something you have tested enough times against reality that it has become a fact of the universe rather than a hope. Madison looked at the dog and the child and the lamp and the darkness outside the window and understood something about what she had never had, and also about what, until this week, she had never thought to want. The plan she made was simple, because complex plans required trust in too many points of failure. She was going to surface publicly, on the record, with Patricia Dunn and Samuel Rice positioned and ready, before Hunter Graves had any opportunity to control the frame. She called one more number, her personal assistant Carla, who had worked for her 6 years, and who she trusted absolutely, and gave her 4 instructions. Then she called the county's non-emergency line and said that Madison Hale was alive, that she had evidence relevant to a federal investigation, and that she would be available at 10 a.m. at the Creston County Sheriff's Department. The news, in the way that news now travels, arrived everywhere simultaneously. The graphic that appeared on television screens across the country read, "Missing CO Madison Hale, alive expected to surface with federal agents tomorrow morning." In a hotel room in Denver, Hunter Graves watched the broadcast on a laptop with the sound off and a glass of water in his hand. And the water began to shake. The press conference at the Creston County Sheriff's Department was a conference room with 12 chairs, a folding table, and a window overlooking the parking lot where, by 8:30 in the morning, 4 television satellite trucks and a growing cluster of reporters had assembled in below-freezing temperatures. Samuel Rice arrived at 7, with 2 colleagues and a sealed evidence case. Patricia Dunn arrived at 7:15 with a recorder and the silence of someone who had been waiting a long time to be in the right room. Hunter Graves's response, delivered through his attorney at 8:45, was a statement that accused Madison of corporate espionage, data theft, and a pattern of erratic behavior consistent with diminished executive capacity. It named Caleb Whitmore specifically as an individual of interest in her disappearance, and suggested that evidence of a coercive dynamic between the two would be forthcoming. The statement was read on air by anchors across the country in the 90 minutes before Madison walked into the conference room with a crutch and Samuel Rice at her shoulder, and a USB drive that she placed on the table in front of the assembled agents with both bandaged hands, and the subsequent 90 minutes made the first 90 look like a warm-up act. Caleb was in the hallway when the first feeds went live. A deputy had offered him coffee, and he was holding it with both hands, watching a monitor on the wall when his own name appeared on screen. Caleb Whitmore, Creston resident, accused of holding missing exec. He thought about Bonnie, in a room down the hall with a county family services worker, and hoped with precision that felt like prayer that she had not seen a television in the last 2 hours. He felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has done the right thing and is watching it get dressed in the wrong clothes. What changed the arc was Rusty. Early that afternoon, Reese's team discovered the wrecked SUV that had run Madison off the road, pushed 40 meters further down the embankment and covered with a cut pine bough, invisible from the road above. Rusty, brought to the site on the theory that his search experience might be useful, located a secondary item within 6 minutes. A burner phone in a waterproof case, wedged in the wheel well. The forensic team also recovered a 9mm firearm, a partial set of prints on the door handle, and traced DNA on the headrest that matched a known private security contractor with documented ties to Meridian Labs and, by a connection that took 1 more week to confirm, to a personal shell company controlled by Hunter Graves. Hunter Graves attempted to leave the country on a private charter flight from Denver International at 2:17 that afternoon. He was detained on the jetway by 4 federal agents, in front of a gate camera whose footage was released by 9 p.m., and watched by approximately 40 million people. He said nothing. He looked, in the footage, like a man who had spent his entire career believing that there was always another exit, and had just learned there wasn't. The aftermath of the kind of event that involves 42 dead patients, a federal indictment, and a $4.8 billion company in regulatory freefall does not resolve cleanly. It resolves the way a very large object falls in stages, each impact creating new damage in directions the original event had not anticipated. Hale Biotech stock fell 61% in the first 3 days, recovered partially, then fell again. Eleanor Pierce resigned and immediately retained criminal defense counsel. Jason Mercer, the company's head of research, cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced charge. 3 board members who had approved audits that should have caught the secondary dataset resigned in a single afternoon, issuing statements that deployed the phrase failed oversight, with a precision calibrated to avoid the word complicit. Madison Hale did not return to her office. She gave depositions. She submitted to the interviews. She handed over every document Carla had been quietly preserving. In an encrypted off-site backup, Carla had understood, without being told, that something serious was happening, because 6 years of working for someone teaches you to read the particular quality of their silences. Madison established a compensation fund capitalized at $90 million for the families of the 42 patients who had died and the 75 who had survived with lasting health consequences, announced an indefinite leave from executive duties, and requested an independent governance review. She drove to Creston on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the press conference, on a day when the temperature had finally climbed above 0 for the first time since January. She drove herself, in a plain rental car, and she parked in front of Caleb's house without calling ahead because she had not known, until she was already most of the way there, that this was where she was going. The house looked exactly as it had the morning she had woken up on the sofa, same faded trim, same dented mailbox, same truck in the driveway with the replacement generator cable that Caleb had installed himself because the repair shop wanted $400 for a job that cost $12 in parts. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out. Bonnie answered the door before she had knocked a second time, because Rusty had already heard her coming. Madison looked at the girl and the dog and the interior of the house behind them, and then she looked at Bonnie's sneakers. The duct tape was still there, freshly applied. A new piece of silver tape across the right toe, laid with the precision of a child who had done it enough times to develop a technique. She was not going to cry about a pair of shoes. She was a woman who had run a multi-billion-dollar company and survived an assassination attempt and testified before federal investigators for 14 hours across 3 days, and she was absolutely not going to cry about a pair of shoes. She looked up at the ceiling for a moment to be safe. Caleb came out of the kitchen drying his hands on a dish towel, and they stood in his hallway, and she said, "I don't know how to do this." And he said, "Do what?" And she said, "This," and gestured at the room. And he understood that she was not talking about the room. He offered her coffee, and she accepted. And they sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and talked about things that had nothing to do with Hale Biotech or Hunter Graves or USB drives. And Bonnie sat between them working on a drawing of Rusty that was technically incorrect in every anatomical detail, and was absolutely, unmistakably, Rusty. The next morning, before anyone in the house was awake, a shoebox appeared on the front step with no note, no return address, and no explanation. Inside were a pair of bright purple high-top sneakers, in a size that matched exactly. 3 months passed. The season turned in the way it always turns in the high country. Not gradually, but suddenly. 1 week of brown slush, and then, almost overnight, the meadows going green along the creek beds and the aspens putting out their first leaves in that particular pale yellow-green that exists for approximately 10 days each spring and then deepens into something more permanent. The town of Creston, which had been briefly and bewilderingly famous, returned to being Creston. The satellite trucks were long gone. The journalists who had crowded the parking lot of the county sheriff's building were covering other things in other places, which was how it was supposed to work. Hale Biotech, under interim leadership, announced a restructured research ethics board with 3 external members, a mandatory trial transparency protocol, and partnerships with 2 university medical programs. The work was genuine in its specifics, if necessarily modest in its early results. Madison sat on the new ethics board in a non-executive capacity and spent a significant portion of each week in conversations with patients' families, conversations she did not find easy and did not pretend to. She found them necessary, in the way that necessary things are often the opposite of comfortable. And she had decided, sometime in a snow-covered forest, that comfort was a standard she could afford to lower. Caleb received a call in early April from Diane, the county mountain rescue coordinator, who had worked alongside him for years and had never stopped thinking of him as part of the team. A state emergency preparedness grant had created a new position, lead trainer for the county's volunteer rescue program, conducting skills assessments and field training twice monthly, part-time in winter, and nearly full-time in summer. The pay was consistent and came with a county health plan. The position had been written, Diane mentioned casually, to accommodate recurring knee issues. He took the job before she had finished explaining it. The house was still the same house. The truck was still the same truck. Though a new alternator had appeared in the garage one day, in early March, in an unmarked cardboard box, which Caleb installed without comment, because some things are better handled with silence on both ends. Bonnie's room had a new bookshelf he had built himself from dimensional lumber, holding a full set of wildlife encyclopedias she had admired in the school library window for 2 years without ever asking for. Rusty had been profiled briefly in a regional newspaper piece about the January events, which resulted in a donation of 8 months' worth of arthritis medication from a local veterinary clinic, whose owner had simply decided to send it. Rusty accepted this with the composure of a dog who had, frankly, done the most important work. On the first day of the first real snow of the following winter, not the testing snow of early November that comes and goes, but the actual snow the committed snow that settles in and stays. Bonnie was at the window, watching it come down, and she turned from the glass and asked Caleb why he thought Rusty had found the woman that night. She asked it with the philosophical openness of a child who is not necessarily looking for a complete answer, only for the beginning of one. Caleb was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the week's mail, which he had been sorting without urgency. He looked up. He looked at Rusty, who was lying on his side in front of the pellet stove, with his eyes half closed and his gray muzzle resting on the floor. The dog's breathing was slow and even, the breathing of a very old animal who has found a warm place and is entirely satisfied with the arrangement. Caleb thought about the night. The road, the snow, the small body in the snow that the dog had found before any human instinct had suggested there was anything to find. He thought about a chain of events so specific, the extra delivery, the one stretch of highway, the one moment Rusty had demanded they stop, that the word random did not quite reach the size of what he was trying to describe. He said, maybe sometimes God sends somebody who's lost to the exact place they were supposed to be found. Bonnie considered this. Then she turned back to the window and watched the snow fall. Outside, the flakes were coming down in the slow, purposeful way of a long storm that had made its decision and was not in a hurry. The light was the particular shade of white-gray that exists only in mountain country in winter, and it filled the room with a quality of stillness that was not emptiness, but the opposite of emptiness, the kind of fullness that requires quiet to be heard. On the porch of a small cabin 20 minutes up the road, Madison Hale stood in a wool coat that was practical rather than expensive, watching the same snow fall on the same ridge. She had been in Creston for a month. In the cabin she was renting from Stuart, who had returned from deer season to find his property briefly famous, and his stove recently repaired, and had charged her $300 per month, out of what she suspected was deliberate underpricing. She was not, in any formal sense, recovered. She was in the process of becoming something she had not yet fully named. She watched the snow and breathed the cold and thought about nothing that had a price tag. And after a while she heard, from somewhere down the road, the sound of a dog barking once, not alarmed, not hunting, just announcing himself to the world as dogs do when they're comfortable, and they want whoever is listening to know they're there. She smiled. She went back inside. The stove was going, and it was warm.